Between 1953 and 1962, 76 choir boys from St. Augustine's Cathedral in Rochester, New York, disappeared without a trace, their families told they had transferred to other parishes or returned home. The cathedral's records show systematic gaps where names should be. Medical examiner reports from the period list unusual injuries on unidentified children found in the Genesee River. Local newspapers received anonymous letters describing screams echoing from the cathedral's basement during evening rehearsals. Yet no investigation was ever launched, no questions officially asked, and no families ever received satisfactory answers about where their sons had gone. St. Augustine's Cathedral stood as Rochester's crown jewel of Catholic architecture, its twin spires piercing the industrial skyline like divine fingers reaching toward heaven. Built in 1868 with donations from the city's wealthiest families, the Gothic revival structure commanded respect from believers and skeptics alike. The cathedral's boys' choir, established in 1889, had become legendary throughout the Northeast. Their angelic voices filled the massive nave during Sunday masses, wedding ceremonies, and funeral services for Rochester's elite. Local newspapers regularly featured photographs of the choir boys in their pristine white surplices and crimson cassocks. Father Matthias Brennan arrived at St. Augustine's in 1951, appointed as choirmaster by Bishop Francis Kearney himself. At 38, Brennan possessed an impressive resume. Graduate of the Pontifical Institute of Sacred Music in Rome, former assistant conductor at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York, and composer of several liturgical pieces performed across American dioceses. The priest's arrival coincided with a golden age for the cathedral's music program. Within months, the choir's membership swelled from 24 to 62 boys, aged 8 to 16. Brennan instituted rigorous auditions, selecting only the most talented young voices from Rochester's Catholic families. Parents considered acceptance into St. Augustine's choir a tremendous honor. The program offered free music education, performance opportunities, and what families believed was moral guidance under the church's protective wing. Many saw it as a pathway to prestigious boarding schools and eventual college scholarships. The cathedral's reputation attracted donations from across New York State. Wealthy benefactors funded new choir robes, imported Italian organ pipes, and construction of practice rooms in the building's basement levels. The Rochester Democrat and Chronicle published glowing reviews of the choir's performances, describing their sound as ethereal and transcendent. Father Brennan quickly became a beloved figure in Rochester's Catholic community. His sermons drew overflow crowds, and his personal attention to each choir member impressed parents during monthly meetings. The priest appeared genuinely devoted to nurturing young talent, often staying late to provide individual voice coaching. The choirmaster maintained strict discipline within the program. Boys arrived at 4:30 p.m. for weekday rehearsals, remaining until 8 p.m. for intensive practice sessions. Weekend rehearsals extended even longer, with some boys staying overnight in the cathedral's dormitory facilities when preparing for major performances. Brennan implemented a hierarchical system among the choir members. Senior boys, designated as prefects, supervised younger singers and maintained order during rehearsals. The priest rewarded exceptional performance with special privileges, solo opportunities, overnight retreats, and private lessons in his study. The cathedral's music library expanded dramatically under Brennan's leadership. He acquired rare medieval manuscripts, contemporary compositions, and what he described as experimental liturgical pieces requiring extensive rehearsal time. Some selections demanded such precision that certain boys practiced individually with the choirmaster for hours. Local families competed for their sons' inclusion in the program. The waiting list grew to over 100 applicants by 1952. Brennan personally interviewed each candidate, assessing not only vocal ability, but also what he termed spiritual receptiveness and dedication to sacred service. The choir's performance schedule intensified throughout 1952, and they sang at diocesan conferences, regional Catholic conventions, and private ceremonies for wealthy patrons. Their reputation spread beyond Rochester, with invitations arriving from parishes in Buffalo, Syracuse, and Albany. Cathedral records from this period show meticulous documentation of rehearsal schedules, performance dates, and individual progress reports for each choir member. Father Brennan maintained detailed files on every boy, including family background information, academic records, and personal observations about their spiritual development. The priest's popularity extended beyond the cathedral walls. He served on the Rochester Catholic School Board, advised the diocese on liturgical matters, and contributed articles to Catholic publications. His photograph appeared regularly in the local Catholic newspaper, often surrounded by smiling choir boys. Parents trusted Father Brennan completely with their children's care. Many families invited him for dinner, seeking his counsel on matters beyond music education. The priest's apparent dedication to the boys' welfare convinced skeptical fathers and impressed devoted mothers who saw him as a saint walking among them. The cathedral's basement underwent significant renovation in 1952, funded by anonymous donations totaling $43,000. Construction crews installed soundproofing materials, practice rooms, and what architectural plans described as specialized rehearsal chambers for intensive vocal training. During this period, the choir achieved unprecedented success. Their 1953 Christmas concert drew over 2,000 attendees, requiring additional seating in the cathedral's transepts. The performance featured complex harmonies and what music critics described as otherworldly vocal arrangements that seemed to transcend traditional sacred music. Father Brennan's influence within the diocese continued growing. Bishop Kearney appointed him to the Liturgical Commission and sought his recommendations for other parishes' music programs. The choirmaster's methods were studied and implemented across Western New York's Catholic institutions. The cathedral's boys' choir represented everything Rochester's Catholic community aspired to achieve: discipline, excellence, and spiritual devotion combined with worldly success. Parents felt privileged to entrust their sons to Father Brennan's guidance, believing they were providing their children with opportunities for both earthly advancement and eternal salvation. No one questioned the priest's methods or the program's intensive demands. The results spoke for themselves: beautiful music, well-behaved boys, and a reputation that brought honor to St. Augustine's Cathedral and the entire Rochester diocese. The community's trust in Father Brennan appeared absolute and unshakable. Yet beneath this facade of musical excellence and spiritual devotion, something far more sinister was beginning to unfold. The same basement chambers that produced those ethereal harmonies would soon become the setting for horrors that would remain hidden for decades, protected by the very reputation that had made the cathedral's choir program so revered throughout the region. The first disappearance occurred on March 15, 1953. Timothy Sullivan, aged 12, failed to return home after evening rehearsal. His mother, Margaret Sullivan, called the cathedral at 9:30 p.m., concerned when her son hadn't arrived for dinner. Father Brennan personally answered the phone, his voice calm and reassuring. Timothy had been selected for an intensive retreat at a monastery upstate, the priest explained. The boy would return within a week, spiritually enriched by the experience. Such opportunities were rare blessings, reserved for the most promising young singers. Margaret Sullivan felt honored rather than worried. Her neighbors congratulated her on Timothy's selection for special training. The local Catholic newspaper even mentioned the retreat program in a brief article about the cathedral's commitment to developing exceptional talent among its choir members. Timothy never came home. When Margaret inquired again, Father Brennan explained that the boy had shown such remarkable progress that the monastery had extended his stay indefinitely. The family received a handwritten letter, allegedly from Timothy, describing his joy at serving God in such a sacred environment. The letter's handwriting resembled Timothy's, though his younger sister noticed subtle differences in the formation of certain letters. Their mother dismissed such concerns as childish imagination. Timothy was growing up, learning discipline and devotion that would serve him throughout his life. Similar incidents began occurring with increasing frequency throughout 1953. 8-year-old Michael Kowalski disappeared in April, followed by 14-year-old Robert Chen in May. Each family received the same explanation. Their sons had been selected for special training at various monasteries throughout New York State. The pattern remained consistent. Father Brennan would personally inform parents of their child's selection, emphasizing the honor and rarity of such opportunities. Families received letters from their missing sons, describing spiritual growth and dedication to sacred music. The handwriting always appeared authentic, though subtle inconsistencies troubled some recipients. Parents who pressed for more specific information about these retreat locations received gentle rebuke from Father Brennan. Such details were confidential, he explained, to protect the monastery's contemplative atmosphere. Excessive worldly contact would compromise the boys' spiritual development and defeat the program's sacred purpose. The cathedral's remaining choir members spoke little about their departed friends. When questioned by parents or siblings, they offered vague responses about the honor of being chosen for advanced training. Their reluctance to discuss details was attributed to jealousy or disappointment at not being selected themselves. Dr. James Morrison, a pediatrician whose son sang in the choir, began noticing behavioral changes among the remaining boys. During routine checkups, several exhibited signs of chronic stress, weight loss, sleep disturbances, and reluctance to discuss their activities at the cathedral. When Dr. Morrison mentioned his concerns to other parents, they dismissed his observations as professional overanalysis. The boys were simply working harder, dedicating themselves more fully to their sacred cause. Such intensity was natural among gifted young performers, striving for excellence. The Rochester Police Department received 3 missing person reports for choir boys during 19. Each case was quickly closed after Father Brennan provided documentation about the monastery retreat program. The priest's reputation and the church's institutional authority discouraged further investigation. Detective Anthony Marconi, assigned to the Sullivan case, attempted to verify the monastery locations mentioned in Father Brennan's statements. His inquiries revealed that 2 of the facilities didn't exist, while the third had no record of hosting any boys from Rochester. When Detective Marconi presented these findings to his superior, Captain William Hayes, the investigation was immediately terminated. Captain Hayes, a devout Catholic whose own nephew sang in the cathedral choir, warned Marconi against pursuing unfounded accusations against respected clergy members. The detective's final report, filed away in the precinct's basement archives, noted significant inconsistencies in Father Brennan's statements. However, no follow-up investigation was authorized, and the case files gathered dust for decades. Strange incidents began occurring during evening rehearsals. Boys reported hearing unexplained sounds from the basement's practice rooms, muffled crying, scratching noises, and what sounded like prayers spoken in languages they couldn't identify. Father Brennan dismissed these reports as imagination or acoustic anomalies in the old building. Several choir members developed sudden illnesses that prevented them from attending rehearsals. Parents noticed their sons would become violently sick before scheduled practice sessions, though they appeared perfectly healthy at other times. Family physicians found no medical explanations for these recurring episodes. The cathedral's janitor, Giuseppe Torino, discovered unusual stains in the basement practice rooms during his. The dark patches on the floor resembled dried blood, though Father Brennan explained they were merely wine stains from communion preparation ceremonies. Torino also reported finding strange objects in the basement, torn pieces of choir robes, personal items belonging to missing boys, and what appeared to be restraints hidden behind heating equipment. When he mentioned these discoveries to Father Brennan, the priest accused him of theft and threatened to report him to immigration authorities. The janitor, an undocumented immigrant from Sicily, ceased asking questions about the basement's contents. He continued his cleaning duties in silence, avoiding the practice rooms during evening hours whenever possible. His wife later recalled that he began drinking heavily and suffered recurring nightmares during this period. Anonymous letters began arriving at the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle in late 1953. The typed messages described disturbing activities at St. Augustine's Cathedral, including references to screaming children and blood rituals conducted during evening hours. The newspaper's editor, a prominent Catholic layman, discarded the letters as anti-Catholic propaganda. Local Protestant ministers received similar anonymous communications describing atrocities allegedly occurring at the cathedral. Most dismissed the claims as fabricated attacks on Catholic institutions. The few who considered investigating were discouraged by their congregations, who feared accusations of religious bigotry. The disappearances continued throughout 1954, with 17 more boys vanishing from the choir program. Each incident followed the same pattern: sudden selection for retreat programs, brief letters home, and gradual cessation of contact. Families were told their sons had chosen to remain in monastic life permanently. Father Brennan's explanations became more elaborate as the number of missing boys increased. He spoke of a growing movement among American Catholic youth toward contemplative religious life, inspired by the spiritual renewal occurring within the church. The Cathedral's choir program was producing future saints, he claimed, young men called to serve God in the most sacred environments. Some parents attempted to visit the monasteries where their sons were allegedly training. They were turned away at the gates, told that the boys were in periods of silent retreat and could not receive visitors. Phone calls to these facilities resulted in similar responses or claims that no records existed of the missing children. The pattern of mysterious illnesses among remaining choir members: boys would collapse during rehearsals, suffer seizures, or develop temporary speech impediments that prevented them from singing. Medical examinations revealed no physical causes for these symptoms, leading doctors to suggest psychological stress or adolescent developmental issues. Dr. Morrison compiled detailed notes about the health problems affecting choir members, documenting patterns that suggested systematic trauma. His attempts to discuss these findings with other parents were met with hostility and accusations of undermining the church's sacred mission. The Cathedral's music program continued receiving praise from diocesan authorities despite the declining number of acts. Father Brennan attributed the smaller choir size to his increasingly selective standards and the natural progression of talented boys toward more advanced spiritual training. Bishop Kearney visited St. Augustine's in November 1955, celebrating a special Mass with the reduced choir. His homily praised Father Brennan's dedication to nurturing young souls and encouraged other parishes to emulate the Cathedral's commitment to spiritual excellence through sacred music. The basement renovations continued throughout this period, with construction crews working during late evening hours to avoid disrupting regular cathedral activities. Workers were sworn to confidentiality about the project's details, though several later reported discovering disturbing materials during the construction process. By the end of 1955, the Cathedral's choir program had lost 31 boys to unexplained disappearances. Yet the community's faith in Father Brennan remained unshaken, protected by the institutional authority of the Catholic Church and the priest's carefully maintained reputation for holiness and dedication to sacred music. The truth began to surface on January 12, 1956, when 14-year-old David Kowalski escaped from the cathedral's basement during what Father Brennan had described as an intensive rehearsal session. The boy ran barefoot through Rochester's snow-covered streets, his choir robe torn and bloodied, screaming incoherently about the room with no windows. David collapsed outside Mercy Hospital, suffering from severe hypothermia, multiple lacerations, and what medical staff described as signs of prolonged physical abuse. His fingernails were torn, his wrists bore rope burns, and strange symbols had been carved into his back with a sharp instrument. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, the emergency room physician who treated David, documented injuries consistent with systematic torture. The boy's medical file, later sealed by court order, contained photographs of wounds that suggested prolonged captivity and ritualistic abuse. Scars on his throat indicated attempts to damage his vocal cords. David's initial statements to hospital staff were fragmented and terrifying. He spoke of underground chambers where boys were kept in cages, forced to sing while being tortured, and subjected to what he called the choosing ceremonies. His descriptions included references to robed figures, burning candles, and screams that echoed through stone corridors. The boy claimed that Father Brennan wasn't working alone. He described other men in religious garments who participated in the abuse, some visiting from outside parishes. David insisted that the missing choir boys weren't at monasteries, but buried beneath the cathedral in rooms that smelled like death and incense. When police attempted to interview David, he became catatonic whenever asked about specific details. The trauma had damaged his ability to provide coherent testimony, making him an unreliable witness in the eyes of law enforcement. His parents were advised to seek psychiatric treatment rather than pursue criminal charges. Dr. Hartwell contacted the Rochester Police Department, providing medical evidence of criminal abuse. Detective Marconi, who had investigated the earlier disappearances, requested permission to search the cathedral's basement. His superior, Captain Hayes, denied the request, citing insufficient evidence and the potential for religious persecution accusations. The hospital's psychiatric evaluation of David revealed a mind shattered by prolonged terror. Dr. Samuel Rothstein, the attending psychiatrist, noted that the boy's symptoms were consistent with severe trauma experienced over an extended period. The child's descriptions of abuse were too detailed and consistent to be mere fantasy. David's escape prompted Father Brennan to accelerate his activities. 3 more boys disappeared within the following week. Their families told they had been selected for immediate transfer to a monastery in Canada. The priest's explanations became more urgent, emphasizing the need for absolute confidentiality to protect the boys' spiritual development. On January 28th, Giuseppe Torino, the cathedral's janitor, broke his silence. Terrified by David's escape and the increased disappearances, he contacted the FBI with information about the basement activities. His detailed statement, written in broken English, described years of witnessing horrors he had been too frightened to report. Torino's testimony revealed the basement's true purpose. The soundproof chambers weren't practice rooms, but torture cells where boys were held for extended periods. He had discovered hidden passages connecting the cathedral to abandoned buildings nearby, creating an underground network used to transport victims undetected. The janitor described finding human remains in the basement's deepest levels, wrapped in altar cloths and hidden behind false walls. He had seen Father Brennan and other men in religious garments conducting ceremonies involving the torture and murder of choir boys, their screams muffled by the soundproofing materials. FBI Special Agent Robert Thornton was assigned to investigate Torino's claims. His initial skepticism turned to horror as he uncovered evidence supporting the janitor's testimony. Surveillance of the cathedral revealed suspicious activities during evening hours, including the arrival of unmarked vehicles and individuals in clerical dress. The federal investigation faced immediate resistance from diocesan authorities. Bishop Kearney claimed the accusations were part of an anti-Catholic conspiracy, threatening to mobilize the church's political influence to stop the investigation. Local Catholic organizations denounced the FBI's interest in the case as religious persecution. Agent Thornton obtained a federal search warrant for St. Augustine's Cathedral on February 15, 1956. The pre-dawn raid involved 42 agents and uncovered evidence that exceeded even the most horrific accusations. The basement's true layout revealed a complex of interconnected chambers designed for prolonged torture and imprisonment. The soundproofed rooms contained medieval torture devices, restraints designed for children, and altars stained with what forensic analysis confirmed was human blood. Hidden compartments held personal items belonging to missing choir boys, including jewelry, clothing, and locks of hair preserved in glass containers. Agents discovered detailed records of the abuse, maintained in Father Brennan's handwriting. The documents described each boy's torture methods, duration of captivity, and ultimate fate. The priest had categorized victims by age, vocal range, and what he termed spiritual receptiveness to various forms of abuse. The most disturbing discovery was a series of photographs depicting the torture and murder of choir boys. The images showed children restrained on altar-like surfaces, their faces contorted in agony as robed figures performed ritualistic abuse. Some photographs captured the moment of death, preserved as grotesque trophies. Father Brennan's private chambers contained extensive correspondence with other clergy members involved in similar activities. The letters revealed a network of predatory priests operating across multiple dioceses, sharing victims and torture methods. References to sacred ceremonies and purification through suffering provided religious justification for their crimes. The basement's deepest level housed a crematorium where bodies were disposed of after the abuse concluded. Forensic teams recovered bone fragments and dental remains from dozens of victims, confirming that the missing choir boys had never left the cathedral alive. Agent Thornton's investigation revealed that the monastery story was entirely fabricated. The letters sent to families were forged by Father Brennan, who had studied each boy's handwriting to create convincing correspondence. The priest's attention to detail in maintaining these deceptions demonstrated calculated planning spanning years. Medical examination of surviving choir members revealed evidence of systematic abuse among boys who had never been reported missing. Many showed signs of drugging, designed to impair memory and prevent coherent testimony about their experiences. The boys' recurring illnesses were symptoms of ongoing poisoning intended to control their behavior. The federal investigation uncovered financial records showing payments to Father Brennan from wealthy individuals in exchange for access to choir boys. The priest had been operating a commercial abuse ring, using his position to recruit victims for clients who paid substantial fees for participation in the torture ceremonies. Giuseppe Torino provided agents with detailed maps of the underground passages, connecting the cathedral to nearby buildings. These tunnels, some dating to the 19th century, allowed the movement of victims and participants without detection. Several connected to private residences owned by prominent Rochester families. The investigation revealed that Bishop Kearney had received reports about suspicious activities at St. Augustine's as early as 1952. Internal diocesan documents, obtained through federal subpoena, showed that church authorities had deliberately ignored evidence of abuse to protect the institution's reputation and avoid scandal. Dr. Morrison's medical records, initially dismissed by parents and authorities, provided crucial evidence of the abuse's systematic nature. His documentation of injuries and behavioral changes among choir members corroborated testimony from survivors and supported the federal case against Father Brennan. The priest's psychological evaluation, conducted by FBI experts, revealed a sophisticated predator who had manipulated his religious authority to access and abuse children systematically. His apparent devotion to sacred music was merely a facade designed to attract victims and maintain community trust. By March 1956, federal agents had compiled evidence linking Father Brennan to the torture and murder of 47 choir boys over a 3-year period. The investigation revealed a crime spree of unprecedented scope and brutality, protected by institutional authority and community denial. The cathedral's basement chambers were sealed as crime scenes, their contents catalogued as evidence in what would become one of the largest child abuse cases in American history. The physical evidence painted a picture of systematic torture that had occurred beneath one of Rochester's most revered religious institutions. On March 22, 1956, 3 days before his scheduled arrest, Father Matthias Brennan vanished from St. Augustine's Cathedral. The FBI surveillance team assigned to monitor his movements found his quarters empty, personal belongings removed, and no trace of his departure route. The priest had seemingly evaporated into the night. Agent Thornton's investigation revealed that Brennan had received advance warning of the impending charges. Phone records showed calls between the cathedral and high-ranking diocesan officials on the night of his disappearance. The Catholic Church's extensive network had likely facilitated the priest's escape to avoid a public trial. The diocese moved swiftly to contain the scandal's impact. Bishop Kearney held a press conference on March 25th, announcing that Father Brennan had suffered a spiritual crisis and voluntarily entered a contemplative monastery for prayer and reflection. The bishop denied all allegations of criminal activity, describing them as attacks on the Catholic faith. Within hours of the press conference, construction crews arrived at St. Augustine's Cathedral. Working around the clock, they sealed the basement chambers with concrete, destroyed evidence that hadn't been seized by federal agents, and began renovating the space for liturgical improvements. The crime scenes were obliterated before independent investigators could examine them. The few surviving victims faced systematic intimidation to prevent their testimony. David Kowalski's family received anonymous threats warning them against cooperating with federal authorities. Their home was vandalized twice, with messages spray-painted on their garage door: "Liars burn in hell" and "Protect Holy Mother Church." Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, who had documented David's injuries, found her medical license under review by the State Board for unprofessional conduct. The investigation, initiated by complaints from prominent Catholic physicians, questioned her competence and accused her of fabricating evidence to promote anti-religious bias. Giuseppe Torino, the janitor whose testimony had triggered the federal investigation, was arrested by immigration authorities on March 30th. Despite having worked legally in the United States for 15 years, he was suddenly classified as an illegal immigrant and deported to Sicily before he could testify at trial. The Rochester Police Department's files on the missing choir boys mysteriously disappeared from evidence storage. Captain Hayes reported a break-in at the precinct, though no other materials were stolen. Detective Marconi's investigation notes, witness statements, and photographs of crime scenes vanished without explanation. Local newspapers received pressure to minimize coverage of the scandal. The Rochester Democrat and Chronicle published only brief articles about the investigation, focusing on the church's denials rather than the evidence of abuse. Editors who pushed for more comprehensive reporting found their positions threatened by influential Catholic advertisers. The FBI's case against Father Brennan collapsed without the priest's capture or cooperation from church authorities. Federal prosecutors faced a defendant who couldn't be located, witnesses who had been intimidated into silence, and physical evidence that had been destroyed by diocesan construction crews. On June 15, 1956, the Department of Justice announced that the investigation into St. Augustine's Cathedral would be suspended due to insufficient evidence and lack of prosecutable defendants. The official statement made no mention of the church's obstruction efforts or the systematic destruction of crime scenes. The families of missing choir boys were offered financial settlements by diocesan attorneys, contingent on signing non-disclosure agreements that prevented them from discussing their children's disappearances. Most families, exhausted by months of legal battles and community hostility, accepted the payments and agreed to permanent silence. David Kowalski never recovered from his trauma. He spent the remainder of his childhood in psychiatric institutions, unable to function normally after his experiences in the cathedral's basement. His family moved to California in 1957, seeking anonymity and distance from the memories that haunted their son. The surviving choir members who hadn't been reported missing displayed severe psychological damage that persisted for decades. Many developed alcohol and drug addictions, suffered chronic depression, and maintained absolute silence about their experiences at St. Augustine's Cathedral. The community preferred to forget rather than acknowledge their suffering. Dr. Samuel Rothstein, the psychiatrist who had evaluated David, published a paper in 1958 describing the long-term effects of ritualistic abuse on children. The article, which appeared in the Journal of Clinical Psychology, was criticized by colleagues as sensationalist and lacking scientific rigor. His professional reputation suffered, and his research funding was withdrawn. The Catholic Church implemented new policies for youth programs following the Rochester scandal, though these measures focused more on preventing publicity than protecting children. Background checks for clergy remained superficial, and reporting requirements for suspected abuse were minimal and rarely enforced. Father Brennan's disappearance sparked rumors about his fate. Some claimed he had been relocated to a monastery in South America under church protection. Others suggested he had been eliminated by diocesan authorities to prevent embarrassing testimony. His true whereabouts remained unknown, and no credible sightings were ever reported. The network of predatory clergy identified in Brennan's correspondence faced no consequences for their involvement in the abuse ring. The FBI's investigation was limited to Rochester, and other dioceses successfully prevented scrutiny of their own personnel. The priests involved in the torture ceremonies continued their careers at different parishes. St. Augustine's Cathedral underwent extensive renovation in 1957, officially described as modernization to accommodate Vatican II reforms. The basement was completely rebuilt, with no trace remaining of the chambers where 47 choir boys had been tortured and murdered. The new space housed offices and meeting rooms for parish activities. A memorial garden was established behind the cathedral in 1958, ostensibly to honor young parishioners who had dedicated their lives to religious service. The small plaques bearing victims' names made no reference to their actual fate, describing them instead as boys who had answered God's call to sacred life. The garden's dedication ceremony was attended by Bishop Kearney and several diocesan officials. Their speeches praised the young men's spiritual devotion and encouraged other families to support the church's youth programs. No mention was made of the torture, murder, or systematic abuse that had ended these children's lives. Local law enforcement maintained its silence about the investigation. Captain Hayes retired in 1959 with full honors, his role in obstructing justice forgotten by superiors who had also participated in the cover-up. Detective Marconi left the police force and moved to Florida, carrying the burden of unsolved crimes and undelivered justice. The Rochester community's collective amnesia about the scandal became complete within a few years. New families moved to the area without knowledge of the cathedral's history. Parents enrolled their children in the rebuilt choir program, trusting in the church's reformed policies and renewed commitment to child safety. The FBI's files on the St. Augustine investigation were classified and sealed for 75 years, preventing researchers and journalists from accessing. Official records mention only a concluded inquiry into allegations of misconduct, with no reference to the evidence of systematic torture and murder. In 1962, 6 years after Father Brennan's disappearance, the final choir boy vanishing occurred. 12-year-old Anthony Russo was reported missing after evening rehearsal. His family told he had been selected for special training at a Canadian monastery. The pattern remained unchanged, the methods perfected by years of successful deception. The total number of victims reached 76 by the program's unofficial end in 1962. No official count was ever published, and diocesan records listed these children as transferred to other ministries or pursuing religious vocations elsewhere. Their actual fate remained hidden beneath layers of institutional denial and systematic cover-up. The Saint. Augustine's choir program was quietly discontinued in 1963, officially due to changes in liturgical music preferences following Vatican II. The cathedral's music ministry shifted to adult volunteers and visiting performers, ending the recruitment of children that had facilitated decades of abuse. By 1965, most Rochester residents had forgotten about the brief scandal that had touched their community. The cathedral continued its regular services, the basement hosted parish meetings, and new generations of Catholic families worshipped in the same sanctuary where systematic torture had been planned and celebrated. The silence became permanent, protected by non-disclosure agreements, institutional power, and community complicity. The voices of 76 choir boys had been silenced forever, their screams buried beneath concrete and collective amnesia. Their truth remained hidden, waiting for historians brave enough to excavate the darkness that once dwelt beneath Rochester's most sacred spaces. Justice never came for the victims of St. Augustine. Their stories were erased, their suffering minimized, and their deaths forgotten by a community that preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truth. The horror that had masqueraded as holy music left no legacy except silence, maintained by those who chose protection of institutions over protection of children. If this story affected you, if you stayed until the end, it means you understand that these hidden truths need to be brought to light. Leave a comment with the city you're watching from. We want to see how far these forgotten stories are reaching, and consider subscribing to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we keep remembering.